But our government is using its huge majority to dictate policy, much of which was not in their manifesto, to steamroll the British people into submission. Even on Mumsnet, Labour voters are turning their backs on the party. Frankly, the Labour government are behaving like a dictatorship, and there is no effective opposition to stop them. I'm sure that there are many in this country that would love to see a Trump-style coup on Sir Keir Starmer.
The argument shifts sharply from foreign affairs to domestic governance, questioning how political power is exercised after an election victory. The focus is not on the legitimacy of the ballot result, but on whether policies now being advanced were clearly endorsed by voters. The claim is that a large parliamentary majority is being used to push through measures that were not explicitly set out beforehand, stretching the limits of democratic consent. References to dissatisfaction among traditional Labour supporters are presented as evidence of internal unease rather than simple partisan disagreement. The lack of a strong parliamentary counterbalance is highlighted as a contributing factor, raising concerns about scrutiny and accountability. The language reflects anxiety that formal democratic processes may be giving way to executive dominance in practice. By invoking public appetite for a more forceful, security-driven leadership model, the argument draws a direct contrast with perceived restraint at home. The implication is not endorsement of such an approach, but a warning that frustration with domestic governance can reshape public expectations of leadership itself.
The Prime Minister's been very clear that we did not recognise the presidency of President Maduro. That's why the UK government sanctioned him and has long called for a peaceful transition to a democratically elected president in Venezuela. On the question of American operations, it's not a question for the UK as to whether America should undertake its operations or not. It's an independent, sovereign question of the American administration. It's not for the British government to provide a running commentary on the actions of other countries in that way.
Keir Starmer said Britain will shed no tears and...
Well, I want to establish the facts first. I want to speak to President Trump. I want to speak to allies. As I say, I can be absolutely clear that we were not involved in that. And as you know, I always say and believe we should all uphold international law. But I think at this stage, fast-moving situation, let's establish the facts and take it from there.
The official British response emphasises continuity, caution and adherence to legal principle. The government reiterates its long-standing refusal to recognise Nicolás Maduro's presidency, explaining the basis for sanctions and its call for a peaceful, democratic transition. At the same time, it draws a firm line between diplomatic positioning and operational responsibility. American military action is described as a sovereign decision, beyond the remit of British approval or condemnation. Calls to establish facts, consult allies, and uphold international law frame the response as measured and procedural, particularly in a rapidly developing situation. The repeated insistence on non-involvement serves to distance the UK from both legal liability and political fallout. The contrast with American decisiveness is implicit rather than stated, allowing the audience to weigh restraint against action. This approach positions legality and process as guiding principles, while leaving open the question of whether such caution is perceived domestically as responsibility or hesitation.
Well, only time will tell. I think the Prime Minister is right, really. We need to wait and see what's happened even between this morning and now. New reports have come out, Venezuelan officials saying that civilians were killed. That certainly didn't seem to be the case when this first happened, and they said it's a clean strike, nobody's been harmed. So it's a picture that is really changing by the minute. And we're going to have to wait for that to crystallise before we can make a real firm assessment on whether he has done the right thing or not.
I think it would have been difficult to not have some collateral damage. I hear that, and it is a real shame that people got caught in the crossfire. I can imagine a strike like that. It's quite difficult to be exactly precise, and that may cause some sort of upset in Venezuela, as I would imagine. But overall, it does sound like the people in Venezuela, and even the lady that was on earlier, she worked with the charity in Venezuela. They were mixed blessings in a sense, pleased that Maduro's gone. They have put up with a few decades of his very dangerous and awful regime.
Judgment is deliberately deferred, with emphasis placed on the uncertainty surrounding early reports from Venezuela. Initial claims of a clean strike are contrasted with subsequent allegations of civilian casualties, illustrating how rapidly the factual picture can evolve. The need for caution is underscored in an environment where information emerges unevenly and often under political pressure. Acknowledgement is given to the likelihood of collateral damage in operations of this nature, alongside recognition of relief among sections of the Venezuelan population following Maduro's removal. This balance separates the outcome from the method, allowing analysis to focus on proportionality and verification rather than emotional response. Maduro's lack of international recognition, including by the UK, is presented as a critical context for understanding public reaction. His departure is framed as broadly welcomed without endorsing the means by which it was achieved. The emphasis remains on evidence, legality, and consequence rather than celebration. The analysis resists absolutism, presenting the event as neither wholly justified nor entirely unlawful. Instead, it is treated as a complex episode requiring time and scrutiny, reflecting wider debates over how democratic states confront authoritarian regimes without undermining the standards they claim to uphold. The discussion implicitly places the Venezuelan operation within a broader international framework where precedent carries significant weight. Removing an unrecognized leader may satisfy immediate strategic or moral objectives, but the method employed shapes expectations beyond national borders. Actions taken by powerful states are observed closely and interpreted by others seeking justification for their own ambitions. In this context, consistency matters as much as intent, particularly when the state acting positions itself as a defender of rules-based order. Concern centers on the message conveyed when decisive action proceeds without broad consultation or transparent justification. Even limited interventions can recalibrate norms, particularly in a geopolitical climate already marked by territorial disputes and rising tension. This reinforces why process remains as important as outcome in post-action assessment. When procedures appear secondary to expediency, the credibility of international standards becomes harder to sustain, especially when those standards are later invoked in response to actions taken by rival powers. The implications extend beyond immediate diplomatic fallout. Allies may reassess assumptions about predictability and coordination, while adversaries may view unilateral action as evidence that constraints are flexible when strategic interests are sufficiently strong. This dynamic complicates collective security arrangements, where shared expectations of behavior underpin trust and cooperation. The absence of enforcement mechanisms in international law heightens this risk, placing greater emphasis on voluntary compliance by influential states. At the same time, the human reality of long-term authoritarian rule is not dismissed. Recognition of the suffering endured by Venezuelans grounds the legal discussion in lived experience, preventing it from becoming abstract or detached. Years of economic collapse, political repression, and social instability form the backdrop against which external intervention is judged. A purely procedural analysis would fail to account for the urgency felt by those directly affected by such conditions. The tension between moral urgency and legal restraint remains unresolved. Acting too slowly can entrench abusive regimes, while acting too forcefully can undermine the very principles used to justify intervention. This balance is further complicated by domestic political pressures within intervening states, where leadership decisions are often framed in terms of strength, resolve, and national interest. Taken together, these arguments reflect a recurring dilemma in modern governance: how to balance decisiveness with responsibility and strength with stability. Power exercised without restraint risks eroding legitimacy, while restraint perceived as hesitation risks weakening deterrence. Rather than offering certainty, the analysis provides a framework for understanding why such decisions continue to divide opinion long after the immediate events have passed, and why their consequences are felt not only in the country concerned, but across the international system as a whole.